Welcome to this video, which is a short introduction to some basic principles in research methodology in education, with a specific focus on close-to-practice research and action or teacher research methodologies. I want to start by explaining some key terms. What is a methodology? A methodology is essentially a framework, a set of conventions and assumptions that we use to help us conduct our projects. Most methodologies are based on assumptions about the nature of truth and knowledge. And the methodologies that we look at in this section are perhaps based on the premise that practitioners can generate new research-based knowledge and insight from within their contexts of practice. Within a methodology, we can employ various methods, and we'll discuss some of these later. The best advice is to read around the subject of methodology, close to practice research, action research, professional inquiry in education, before deciding on what sort of research methodology you'd like to employ. You'll need to weigh up the affordances and limitations of the various methodological frameworks that you encounter, and the extent to which they fit with what it is you want to research. It's important to think carefully about the ethical implications of the methodological frameworks that you employ. Do have a look at the ethical guidance on this site. I want here to contrast two well-established forms of methodology so that we can get a sense of what each of them offers us. On the one hand, we have an overview of some of the affordances of the well-established social research methodological framework, and on the right-hand side, a practitioner-led methodology. The first thing to note is that in some, not all I'd stress, but in some social research, externality can be seen as an advantage, and it can offer the researcher a degree of objectivity and detachment. Detachment can sometimes give a certain clarity to analysis. Whereas in a practitioner-led methodology, being deeply embedded in a work context is seen as essential to the research process, and the researcher makes no claims to objectivity and acknowledges their influence over the process. As with all research methodologies, there is a lot of debate both within these research traditions and between them. The best advice I can give is to read around these and other frameworks and decide what you want out of your research and what suits your objectives most appropriately. In fact, lots of educational researchers are actually quite pragmatic about methodology and will choose the best set of tools for the research that they're conducting. The other key distinction to draw to your attention in respect of both of these frameworks is that some, and again not all, social research methodologies may stop at the point where they draw conclusions and findings. Whereas in many practice-based research models, there may be an onus to keep going, to apply the new knowledge back into practice. New knowledge and insight are products of the research process, but so too are enhanced professional practices. Implementing change during practitioner-led research is complex and tricky, and in fact, some methodologies in the work-based research tradition may go through 2 or 3 or more cycles of the research process, finding out new things, applying them back to practice, evaluating, identifying a new concern, and going through the cycle again and again, all as part of the same project. Again, the best advice is to explore these methodologies and decide what suits your project. Another key feature of practitioner-led research is the position of the practitioner researcher. They're deeply embedded in the life of the organisation where they're conducting their research, and, as you can see on the right, they'll have to think about many things. In analysing the data and the evidence, the professional and social practices of the organisation, they'll need to consider their relationship with their research participants, who may also be their colleagues and learners. They'll have to think about making sense of how to apply new knowledge to practice, as we've already discussed, but also think about their own place in the whole. As you can see on the right, practitioner researchers need to be self-aware about their relationship with their work, with their research, and the context that they're working in. They need to be self-evaluative, honest about the impact they've had or not had, and honest about their influence as a researcher and practitioner on the findings. In some research projects, especially close to practice research, there can be collaboration between an external researcher and an internal practitioner researcher. This is sometimes called co-production, where the research draws on different forms of expertise. At the heart of the co-produced research model is some sense of a middle ground or negotiated position between the two frameworks we looked at on the previous slide. Externality and insider insights are both deemed useful in different ways. For example, practitioners can draw on specialist research expertise, if they're not specialists themselves, and on an external perspective. It can demystify the research process, which can seem intimidating and esoteric. and it can help practitioners to reconceptualise their role in relation to research-produced knowledge. Crucially for researchers, they can gain insights into practice-based professional knowledge, the practical applications of the findings of the research, a detailed appreciation of the realities of the practice context, things they might find it difficult to have access to without an insider collaborator. Co-produced research also has its affordances, and again, the best advice is to read around the subject if it appeals to you as an approach to methodology, to evaluate its fit with your proposed research. Moving on to specific methods, it's difficult to cover everything in a short video, but here are some of the main methods that are used in practitioner-led research projects. So interviews, focus groups, reflective journals, questionnaire-based surveys, and observations. Reflective journals are one of the staple components of teacher and practitioner-led inquiry and can be used to capture the researcher-practitioner's reflections whilst they're still fresh. They can also be used to build your ideas for interpretation and analysis before you start the formal analysis process itself. It can also function as a record of events and issues that may affect the research process or the outcomes of the research. They can also be a useful outlet for the researcher-practitioner. Research, like practice, can be invigorating and inspiring, but it can also be challenging and frustrating. A journal can be a useful outlet to begin to articulate and reflect on this. Perhaps the most commonly used form of interviewing in educational and practitioner-led research is the semi-structured interview. It basically involves the researcher asking an interviewee, who's agreed to be interviewed, a series of questions, but allowing the interviewee enough freedom and flexibility to answer, digress, revisit, and expand as they see relevant. They're a useful tool for researchers as they enable a researcher to gain rich, detailed insights into the experiences, realities, values, and reflections of the person being interviewed. And their adaptable structure means that they provide a balance between guided and open-ended discussion and allow for flexibility and digression. One limitation of interviews is that they do take time, both to conduct and transcribe if you've recorded them. Each semi-structured interview will be different, and they produce detailed insight, but not of the sort that can be aggregated to draw a numerical or statistical conclusion. They're not particularly suitable for finding out the views of large numbers of people. Individual interviews can perhaps be intimidating for working with learners, especially children and young people. School pupils can find lengthy periods of verbal interaction difficult and not particularly engaging during research projects. A related methodology to interviews are focus groups, where a group of around 5 to 10 people who've agreed to take part will discuss a particular issue in response to questions or discussion prompts by the researcher who facilitates the discussion. Focus groups are useful for observing the range of opinion or experiences, examining consensus and divergent opinions and experience on a particular issue. They also lend themselves well to interactive and engaging approaches, such as collaborative tasks. But they too have their limitations. The facilitator has to work very hard to guide the discussion, to ensure that everyone has a say and that the discussion isn't dominated by more opinionated members of the group. And if you've recorded the focus group, it can sometimes be difficult to transcribe focus groups and differentiate between participants. Questionnaire-based surveys are another commonly used method in practitioner-led research in education. Unlike interviews, they are a very good way of reaching large numbers of people quickly and efficiently. Questionnaires don't normally offer the level of depth that interviews do, but if you use questions with pre-coded answers, then you can draw quantitative and statistical conclusions from them based on the views of large groups of people. But surveys do need careful planning and very precise wording in order to be effective. You'll need to think about who you want to sample and how likely they are to want to respond. Surveys can fail because of low response rates, which means that you don't have enough data to draw meaningful conclusions. You'll need to make sure your questions are clear, precise, and that they actually capture or measure what it is you want to know. There are a lot of options open to you in terms of question forms: open questions, dichotomous questions, multiple choice questions, Likert scale questions. I'd urge you to look at sources on questionnaire design, which appear in the further reading section. Observations are a commonly used tool in educational research, where a researcher might want to look at what's happening in a particular learning setting, such as a classroom, lecture theatre, or seminar room, for example. As with all the methods and methodologies discussed in this video, do ensure that you look at the material on ethics before considering observations. Some observations are conducted by what are known as participant observers. That is, researchers who are also participating in the activity being observed. In other cases, a researcher can choose to be a non-participant observer who may sit or stand out of the way observing from a distance and not taking part. The form of data gathered during an observation can also differ. In some cases, the data gathered can be unstructured, where the researcher records notes on what's happened, giving rich and detailed descriptions, often of incidents, interactions and reflections. In other cases, a researcher might use a matrix to record a number of predetermined actions, incidents or behaviours of a particular kind, so as to be able to quantify them. So just to summarise what we've covered in this video, as a practitioner researcher, you have a range of methodologies and methods available to you. The best advice is to read around methodology to find out more about which of the methodologies you have at your disposal and to evaluate their affordances and their limitations. And then to decide which are the most suitable for your research project and to answer your research questions. Finally, as a researcher practitioner, think about your role and position in the research process and your context of practice. Reflect honestly on the likely influence your dual role will have on the research process when planning your methodology. Here are the sources that have been referred to in this video. And here's some suggested further reading on the ground that we've covered. Also, don't forget that you can look at examples of teacher inquiry projects that were conducted as part of the Wales Masters in Educational Practice.